High in the Montana wilderness stood a farmhouse that hadn't seen a living soul in 20 years, and Sarah Hayes, freshly released from the women's reformatory, with nothing but a bus ticket and $43, had just learned it was hers. The inheritance lawyer's words still echoed in her mind as she stood at the county clerk's office. Her grandmother, a woman she'd never known existed, had left her 160 acres and whatever secrets lay buried in that isolated valley. Sarah had no family, no job prospects, and a record that ensured no one would give her a second chance. This crumbling property was her only option, but the lawyer's warning haunted her. 3 previous inheritors had tried to claim it, and all 3 had walked away within a week, refusing to speak of what they'd found. What could make strangers abandon free land? What was her grandmother hiding in those mountains, and why had no one dared to stay? The social worker's office smelled of stale coffee and government-issued disinfectant, a scent that Sarah Hayes had come to associate with institutions and low expectations. She sat in a hard plastic chair that had been designed for maximum discomfort, her hands folded in her lap, studying the chipped polish on her short nails as Miss Chen droned on about job placement programs and parole requirements. Sarah was 28 years old, though the 9 years she had spent in the women's reformatory had carved lines around her eyes that made her look older, harder, like a woman who had been through a war and lost. Her auburn hair, cropped short for practicality, framed a lean face with high cheekbones and gray eyes that held a wary, watchful quality. She wore donated clothes, jeans that were a size too big and a faded blue sweater, and she carried everything she owned in a worn duffel bag at her feet. The crime that had sent her away at 19 had been born of desperation, a robbery gone wrong when she was homeless and starving on the streets of Denver, and though she had paid her debt to society, the world would never let her forget it. Miss Chen was explaining something about transitional housing when the office door opened and a woman walked in who did not belong in this tired, fluorescent-lit space. She was in her early 60s, dressed in an elegant charcoal gray suit that spoke of money and power, her silver hair styled in a professional bob, and she carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Sarah had earned in her entire life. She introduced herself as Margaret Sterling, attorney at law, and asked Miss Chen for a private moment with her client. The social worker looked confused but complied, gathering her papers and stepping out into the hallway. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. Margaret Sterling sat down across from Sarah, her movements precise and controlled, and opened her briefcase with the deliberate care of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. She pulled out a thick manila folder and a sealed envelope, placing them on the desk between them. "Miss Hayes," she began, her voice measured and professional, "I represent the estate of Elizabeth Marie Hayes, who passed away 6 weeks ago in Timber Falls, Montana." Sarah felt the words wash over her without comprehension at first, the name meaning nothing, stirring no memory or recognition. Margaret continued, explaining that Elizabeth Hayes was Sarah's maternal grandmother, that she had left behind a substantial piece of property, and that Sarah was the sole living heir. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah had no family, had grown up believing she was utterly alone in the world after her mother died when she was 6 years old, a vague memory of a woman with sad eyes and gentle hands who had succumbed to an overdose in a motel room. She had been swallowed by the foster care system, moving from home to home, belonging nowhere, and the idea that there had been someone out there, someone connected to her by blood, was almost incomprehensible. Margaret slid the deed across the desk, a legal document that transferred ownership of 160 acres of land and all structures thereon to Sarah Elizabeth Hayes. The property was in a remote valley in the Montana mountains, hours from the nearest town, a working farm that had been abandoned for 20 years. Margaret's expression shifted then, the professional mask slipping to reveal something else, something that looked uncomfortably like pity mixed with concern. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone, and explained that this property had a history, that 3 previous distant relatives had tried to claim it over the past 2 decades, and that each one had abandoned it within days, some within hours, refusing to speak of what they had found or experienced there. "The locals," Margaret said carefully, "consider it cursed." Sarah looked at the deed, at the official seals and signatures that promised her something she had never had, a place that was hers, land with her name on it, a chance at a life beyond halfway houses and minimum wage jobs that would never hire someone with her record. Margaret was still talking, warning her about the isolation, the difficulties, the strange reputation, but Sarah was no longer listening. She had spent 9 years in a cell, had survived things that would have broken weaker people, and the idea of a cursed farm in the middle of nowhere did not frighten her. It called to her. For the first time since walking out of the reformatory 3 days ago, Sarah felt something stir inside her chest, a fragile, dangerous thing that might have been hope. Margaret Sterling pulled a second folder from her briefcase, this one noticeably thicker, and the look on her face suggested she was about to share information she would rather not have to deliver. "Miss Hayes," she began, her tone shifting from professional to something more personal, more urgent. "I need you to understand what you are walking into, because I have a legal obligation to disclose the full history of this property, and a moral obligation to warn you." She opened the folder and pulled out 3 separate files, laying them side by side on the desk like evidence at a trial. In 2007, 2 years after Elizabeth's disappearance, a distant cousin named Thomas Whitaker came forward with a genealogical claim to the property. He was a retired banker from Seattle, a practical man with resources and legal representation. He took possession of the deed, hired contractors to assess the property, and drove up to the farm with his wife to begin planning renovations. They stayed for 6 hours. Margaret paused, letting the brevity of that time frame sink in. When they left, Thomas Whitaker refused to discuss what had happened, would not return calls from his own lawyers, and within a week had signed away all claim to the property, asking only that his name be removed from any association with it. His wife required psychiatric care for anxiety and refused to ever speak about their time there. The second file told a similar story. In 2012, a woman named Jennifer Hayes Morrison, a distant relative through Elizabeth's father's line, attempted to claim the farm. She was younger, in her 30s, a real estate developer who saw the property as a potential resort investment. She arrived with a surveying team and camping equipment, planning to stay for a week to conduct a full assessment. They left after 1 night. Jennifer filed a legal petition to have the property condemned as unsafe, though she provided no specific evidence or explanation, and when questioned by the county, she became agitated and hostile, ultimately dropping the petition and disappearing from all contact. The third attempt, Margaret continued, her voice growing quieter, was in 2018, just 7 years ago. A man named David Chen, a nephew twice removed, came with his teenage son, hoping to turn the property into a small organic farm. They were there for less than 3 hours before David called me from his cell phone, his voice shaking so badly I could hardly understand him, demanding to know how to immediately and irrevocably surrender all claim to the land. When I asked what happened, he hung up, and I have never heard from him again despite multiple attempts to contact him. Sarah sat perfectly still, her face betraying nothing, though inside she felt the cold finger of unease trace down her spine. Margaret gathered the files and set them aside, pulling out a newer document. The property itself has been empty for 20 years, since the spring of 2005 when your grandmother Elizabeth vanished. The official record states that she was reported missing by a concerned neighbor who noticed her truck had not moved in several weeks. A search was conducted, but no trace of her was ever found. 6 months later, she was declared legally dead. The farm has sat vacant ever since, and here is where things become particularly unusual. The county attempted to seize the property for unpaid taxes in 2008, but they discovered that Elizabeth had established an irrevocable trust in 2004, 1 year before her disappearance, and had prepaid property taxes for 50 years in advance. The trust was ironclad, written by one of the best estate lawyers in the state, and it specified that the property could only pass to her direct descendants, with you being the sole heir. Margaret pulled out another document, this one marked with a corporate logo. Perhaps even stranger is the persistent interest from Apex Resource Group, a mining and resource extraction corporation with significant operations in Montana. They have attempted to acquire this property at least 7 times over the past 15 years through various legal mechanisms, offering sums far beyond the land's apparent value. Each time, the trust's language has prevented any sale or transfer. They even tried to claim mineral rights through an obscure territorial-era statute, but that too failed. Their interest, Miss Hayes, is not normal, and it suggests there is something about this land that has value beyond what is visible. Margaret reached into her briefcase one final time and pulled out a large brass key attached to a faded red ribbon and a hand-drawn map on aged paper that showed the route from Timber Falls to the property. with landmarks and distances carefully noted in precise handwriting. "I am giving you these," she said, "and I am fulfilling my legal duty by transferring the deed, but I am also giving you a piece of advice that I hope you will take seriously. If you go to that farm, if you choose to claim this inheritance, promise me that you will leave at the first sign of trouble, at the first moment something feels wrong. 3 people before you ran from that place, and your grandmother disappeared from it, and whatever is there, whatever secret it holds, may not be worth your life." Sarah took the key and the map, feeling their weight in her hands, solid and real and undeniable, and looked into Margaret Sterling's worried eyes with a calmness that came from having already lost everything that mattered, from having nothing left to fear. The Denver Greyhound station smelled of diesel fumes and humanity, a vast echoing space filled with people in transit, all of them going somewhere that promised to be better than where they had been. Sarah Hayes stood in line with her ticket clutched in one hand and her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, everything she owned in the world compressed into that single worn canvas container. The bag held 3 changes of clothes, a toiletry kit, a paperback novel she had read 7 times in the Reformatory, $43 in crumpled bills, the brass key and hand-drawn map from Margaret Sterling, and the deed to a property she had never seen. The bus that would take her north was an aging vehicle with faded blue and silver paint, its engine rumbling with a tired persistence that suggested it had made this journey 1,000 times before. She found a seat near the back, next to a window that was scratched and cloudy but still offered a view of the world sliding past. As the bus pulled out of the station and onto the highway, Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool glass and watched Denver disappear behind her, the city where she had committed the crime that had defined her adult life fading into memory and distance. The journey to Timber Falls would take 18 hours, a slow crawl north through the heart of the American West, and she had nothing to do but sit and think and remember. The landscape began to change almost immediately, the flat urban sprawl giving way to rolling plains that stretched endlessly under a vast sky. She watched the transformation with a quiet fascination, seeing the world shift from concrete and strip malls to open grassland dotted with cattle and the occasional lonely farmhouse. The plains gradually yielded to foothills, gentle rises that grew steeper and more dramatic with each passing mile, and then finally the mountains appeared on the horizon, jagged peaks capped with snow that caught the afternoon sun and gleamed like broken glass. She had never seen mountains like these, had spent her entire life in the flat urban corridors of Denver, and the sheer scale of them filled her with something that might have been awe or might have been fear. During the long hours, her mind drifted back to the Reformatory, to the 9 years she had spent behind walls and fences, learning to survive in a world of hierarchies and unspoken rules. She thought about the carpentry workshop, the one place where she had found something resembling peace, where the smell of sawdust and the feel of wood under her hands had given her a skill and a purpose. Old Bill, the workshop supervisor, had been a tough man with scarred hands and a surprising patience, and he had taught her to read wood grain, to measure twice and cut once, to take pride in work done well. She had made friends there too, women like herself who had made mistakes and were trying to find their way back to something better. She thought of Carmen, who had protected her during her first terrifying weeks, and of Diane, who had taught her to play chess and talked about philosophy during the endless empty hours. Both were gone now, released to uncertain futures, and Sarah wondered if they had found what they were looking for, or if the world had pulled them back down into the chaos they had tried to escape. The bus stopped several times, in small towns with names she did not recognize, and passengers came and went like ghosts. Somewhere past the Montana border, as the sun was beginning to set and paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a bun took the seat beside her. The woman introduced herself as Evelyn, and when she pulled out a paper bag containing sandwiches and offered one to Sarah with a grandmotherly insistence, Sarah accepted with a gratitude that surprised her. They ate together in companionable silence for a while before Evelyn asked where Sarah was headed. "Timber Falls," Sarah replied, and she saw something flicker across the old woman's face, a shadow of concern. Evelyn set down her sandwich and turned to look at Sarah directly, her expression serious. "That is a company town, dear," she said quietly, her voice carrying a warning that was gentle but unmistakable. "Apex Resource Group owns half the businesses there, employs half the people, and runs things the way they see fit. It is not a place where people ask too many questions or stand up for themselves if they know what is good for them. The company takes care of its own and does not take kindly to outsiders or troublemakers. Sarah felt the words settle over her like a shroud, connecting to Margaret Sterling's warnings about Apex's persistent attempts to acquire her grandmother's property. And as the bus continued its journey into the darkening mountains, she understood that she was not just traveling to claim an inheritance, but moving towards something far more dangerous and complex than she had imagined. The bus pulled into Timber Falls just after dawn, and Sarah stepped down onto cracked pavement in a town that looked like time had forgotten it existed. Main Street stretched out before her, a single wide road lined with buildings that had been constructed during some more prosperous era and were now quietly surrendering to decay. Half the storefronts were empty, their windows dark and dusty, with faded for-lease signs that looked like they had been hanging for years. The businesses that remained open had a sameness to them that Sarah noticed immediately, a subtle corporate uniformity in their signage and appearance. The gas station, the diner, the hardware store, they all bore small plaques near their entrances with the Apex Resource Group logo, a stylized mountain peak over crossed pickaxes, and the phrase "Proud Apex Community Partner." The air was cold and thin, sharp with the scent of pine and the faint sulfurous smell of mining operations somewhere in the distance, and the mountains rose up on all sides like the walls of a prison. Sarah walked down the empty street, her duffel bag heavy on her shoulder, searching for somewhere to buy basic supplies before attempting the final leg of her journey. She found a general store wedged between a shuttered pharmacy and a boarded-up cafe, its wooden sign reading Frank's Mercantile, in hand-painted letters that had faded to barely legible. A bell chimed as she pushed through the door into a dim interior that smelled of old wood and dust and the ghost of 1,000 transactions. The store was a relic, with creaking floorboards and tall shelves stocked with canned goods, basic tools, work clothes, and the essentials of mountain living. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with a lined face and shrewd blue eyes, wearing a flannel shirt and a canvas apron. He looked up as she entered, his expression settling into the practiced friendliness of a shopkeeper greeting a potential customer. "Morning," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "What can I help you with?" Sarah moved through the narrow aisles, gathering items she thought she might need: matches, lamp oil, canned food, a sturdy flashlight, batteries, basic first aid supplies, and a roll of duct tape. She brought her selections to the counter, and Frank began ringing them up on an ancient cash register that dinged with each entry. He made small talk as he worked, asking if she was passing through or visiting someone local, and Sarah, seeing no reason to be evasive, pulled out the hand-drawn map Margaret Sterling had given her and asked if he could point her in the right direction. "I am looking for this property," she said, placing the map on the counter and pointing to the marked location, the old Hayes farm up in the valley. The change in Frank was immediate and absolute, as if someone had flipped a switch inside him. His friendly expression vanished, replaced by a cold, wary blankness that made his face look like carved stone. He stared at the map for a long moment, then at Sarah, then at the map again, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its warmth. "The Hayes place," he said flatly, not a question but a confirmation that carried the weight of judgment. Two other customers who had been browsing the shelves, a middle-aged woman in a wool coat and a young man in work clothes, both stopped what they were doing and turned to look at Sarah. The woman took 3 deliberate steps backward, putting distance between herself and Sarah as if she carried some contagious disease, and the young man simply turned and walked out of the store without buying anything, the bell chiming his rapid departure. Frank finished ringing up her supplies with mechanical efficiency, his movements stiff and unwelcoming, and when he told her the total, his voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah counted out the bills from her dwindling cash, and as Frank handed her the change, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Some places are empty for a reason, miss," he said, his voice so low that only she could hear it, "and some questions do not have answers that anyone wants to find. My advice, which you did not ask for but I am giving anyway, is to turn around, get back on that bus, and forget you ever heard the name Hayes." She took her bags and left without responding, stepping back out into the cold morning air with Frank's warning echoing in her mind. She spent the next hour trying to find someone willing to drive her to the property, asking at the gas station and the diner, but every person she approached reacted the same way, with suspicion and refusal, and she began to understand that the entire town knew about the farm and wanted nothing to do with it or anyone associated with it. Finally, she found a taxi driver, a grizzled man in his 50s named Roy, who sat in a battered sedan outside the diner, and when she offered him the last of her cash, $30 for what should have been a $15 ride, he agreed with obvious reluctance. He drove her out of town in complete silence, his jaw clenched and his hands tight on the steering wheel, following a winding mountain road that climbed steadily into the wilderness. After 20 minutes, he pulled over at a turnoff where a barely visible dirt track disappeared into the dense forest, and he told her in a voice that allowed no argument that this was as far as he would go, that the main road ended here, and she would have to walk the rest of the way. And as she climbed out with her duffel bag and watched him drive away in a spray of gravel, she understood that she had crossed some invisible boundary and was now truly alone. The trail began as nothing more than 2 faint ruts in the earth, barely visible beneath a carpet of pine needles and encroaching vegetation, and Sarah followed it upward into the dense forest with her duffel bag digging into her shoulder and her breath coming in short gasps as the altitude and the climb took their toll. The path wound through towering pines and Douglas firs, their trunks massive and ancient, their branches creating a canopy overhead that filtered the morning sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. She had walked perhaps half a mile when she encountered the first obstacle, a large pine tree that had fallen directly across the trail, blocking it completely. At first glance, it appeared to be a natural occurrence, the kind of thing that happened in forests where trees aged and storms brought them down. But as Sarah climbed over the massive trunk, her hands gripping the rough bark, she noticed something that made her pause. The tree's root ball was still partially attached, but the breakpoint showed no signs of rot or disease, and the way it had fallen, perfectly perpendicular to the trail at the narrowest point between 2 large boulders, seemed too precise to be accidental. She filed the observation away and continued climbing. The second blockage came another quarter-mile up, this time a tangle of fallen branches and saplings that forced her to push through dense underbrush, the thorns catching on her clothes and scratching her hands. Again, it felt deliberate, designed not to completely prevent passage but to make it difficult and unpleasant, to discourage anyone from continuing. The third obstacle was unmistakable in its intent, a wall of deadfall timber stacked across the trail in a way that could only have been constructed by human hands, and Sarah had to detour 50 yards off the path, scrambling over rocks and through thick brush, before she could find a way around it. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make this trail as inaccessible as possible, and the question of who and why burned in her mind as she pushed forward. The climb took nearly 2 hours, her legs aching and her shoulders screaming in protest from the weight of the bag, but she refused to stop, driven by a stubborn determination that had been forged in far harder places than this mountain trail. Finally, the forest began to thin, the dense walls of trees giving way to scattered pines and open spaces, and she emerged into a small valley that took her breath away. It was a bowl of land cradled between mountain peaks, perhaps 100 acres of gently rolling meadow that had once been cultivated fields but were now overgrown with wild grasses and scattered wildflowers. A stream cut through the valley floor, glinting in the sunlight, and at the far end, backed by a stunning vista of snow-capped peaks, stood the farmhouse. It was a 2-story structure built in the classic Montana style, constructed of weathered gray logs with a steep pitched roof that was designed to shed heavy snow. The wood had aged to a silvery color, and the porch that wrapped around the front sagged slightly on one side, but the bones of the building looked solid, strong, as if it had been built by someone who understood how to create something that would endure. To the left of the house stood a large barn, its roof partially collapsed on one end, the red paint that had once covered its walls now faded and peeling. A smaller structure, likely a well house, was almost completely covered in vines, and scattered around the property were the remnants of fences and outbuildings in various states of decay. Sarah walked slowly across the overgrown field toward the house, her eyes taking in every detail, and it was then that she began to notice the things that did not fit the narrative of 20 years of abandonment. The windows, all of them, were intact, not a single pane broken despite 2 decades of storms and the kind of vandalism that typically befell empty properties. The front door, when she reached it, was not hanging open or rotted through but firmly closed and secured with a heavy modern padlock that looked no more than a few years old. As she circled the house, she saw that the forest, which had aggressively reclaimed the fields and surrounded the outbuildings, stopped at a precise perimeter about 20 feet from the main structure, as if something, or someone, had been cutting back the encroaching vegetation, maintaining a clear boundary. There were no broken shutters, no visible signs of animal intrusion, no graffiti or evidence of human trespassers, and the roof, though weathered, showed no obvious holes or major damage. This was not a property that had been sitting neglected and forgotten for 2 decades, and as Sarah stood in the shadow of her grandmother's house with the brass key heavy in her pocket, she felt the first real stirring of unease. The understanding that whatever had driven 3 people to flee this place was still here, waiting. The brass key slid into the modern padlock with a smooth precision that spoke of regular maintenance, and when it clicked open, Sarah pulled it free and wrapped her fingers around the cold iron door handle, taking a breath before pushing inward. The door resisted for a moment, its hinges stiff from disuse, and then swung open with a low groan that echoed through the interior, releasing a breath of stale air that carried the scent of dust and old wood and something indefinable, the smell of time standing still. She stepped across the threshold into a front room that was dim and shadowed, the windows filtering only muted light through years of accumulated grime, and as her eyes adjusted, she found herself standing in what could only be described as a time capsule. The room was furnished with simple, sturdy pieces, a sofa and 2 armchairs arranged around a stone fireplace, a heavy wooden coffee table, bookshelves lining one wall, all of it covered with white sheets that had been carefully draped to protect the furniture beneath. Dust lay thick on every surface, coating the sheets in a fine gray powder that puffed into the air with each of Sarah's careful steps. But beneath the dust and the stillness, everything was preserved, intact, waiting. She moved through the front room into a kitchen that occupied the back half of the first floor, and here the sense of interrupted life became even stronger. Dishes sat in the cupboards, plain white plates and bowls stacked neatly. Cast iron pans hung from hooks above an old wood-burning stove. A kettle rested on one of the burners. The kitchen table was bare except for a thin layer of dust, and when Sarah opened the cupboards, she found canned goods with expiration dates from 2005. 20 years old, but still lined up in orderly rows as if their owner might return at any moment to use them. A narrow staircase in the corner of the kitchen led to the second floor, and Sarah climbed it slowly, her hand on the smooth wooden railing, each step creaking under her weight. The upstairs hallway was lined with 3 doors, all closed, and she opened them one by one. The first was a small bedroom with a single bed and a dresser, Spartan and impersonal, likely a guest room. The second was larger, with a double bed and a quilt folded at its foot, but it too felt unused, a space prepared but never occupied. The third door opened into the master bedroom, and it was here that Sarah stopped, her breath catching in her throat. This room was different, lived in, filled with the unmistakable presence of the woman who had inhabited it. The bed was neatly made with a faded patchwork quilt, and on the nightstand sat a small lamp, a glass of water that had long since evaporated to a ring of mineral deposits, and 3 books stacked with their spines facing out. Sarah read the titles, works on geology and environmental science, and felt the first real connection to the grandmother she had never known. A large oak dresser stood against one wall, and when Sarah opened the closet door, she found clothes still hanging, flannel shirts and sturdy jeans, a heavy winter coat, hiking boots lined up on the floor. It was as if Elizabeth Hayes had simply stepped out of the room, intending to return, leaving everything in its place, frozen in the moment of her disappearance. On top of the dresser sat a small collection of personal items, a hairbrush with strands of gray hair still caught in its bristles, a wooden jewelry box containing simple pieces, and a framed photograph that drew Sarah forward as if pulled by invisible strings. The photograph showed a woman in her early 60s standing in front of this very farmhouse, her hand raised to shield her eyes from the sun. She had a strong face with high cheekbones and gray eyes that looked directly into the camera with an expression of fierce intelligence and quiet determination, and Sarah felt a shock of recognition, seeing in that face echoes of her own features, the same bone structure, the same set of the jaw. With trembling hands, Sarah picked up the frame and turned it over, and there, written on the back in faded blue ink, was a message that shattered what remained of her emotional defenses. The words read, "For Sarah, when she's ready, the truth is in the land. Love, Grandma Elizabeth, 2004. Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed, the photograph clutched in her hands, and felt tears she had not shed in years begin to stream down her face. In 2004, she had been 9 years old, a scared and angry child lost in the foster care system, moving from home to home, believing herself completely alone in the world, and all that time, her grandmother had been here, alive, knowing about her, leaving her this message, this inheritance, this truth that waited to be discovered. Elizabeth Hayes had known, and she had been preparing something for a granddaughter she would never meet. And as Sarah sat in that silent room surrounded by the remnants of a life cut short, she understood that she had not just inherited property, but a mission, a purpose, and a connection to the only family she had ever had. Sarah spent the remainder of the afternoon transforming the small guest bedroom into a space where she could sleep, stripping the dusty sheets from the furniture and shaking them out on the porch, sweeping the floor with a broom she found in a closet, and airing out the mattress which, despite its age, seemed remarkably free of mold or damage. She used the supplies she had bought in Timber Falls to make the room habitable, laying out her few possessions with a care that came from having owned so little for so long. And as the sun began to sink behind the western peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and purple, she turned her attention to building a fire in the large stone fireplace that dominated the front room. The chimney drew well despite 2 decades of disuse, and soon she had a small blaze crackling, its warmth pushing back against the chill that settled over the mountains with the coming darkness. She ate a meager dinner of canned beans heated over the fire, and a piece of bread from town, sitting on the sheet-covered sofa and staring into the flames, trying not to think about how utterly alone she was, how far from any help, how complete the silence was becoming as night fell. The isolation was profound in a way she had never experienced, different from the loneliness of a cell which was at least filled with the constant background noise of other human beings, different from the anonymity of city streets where you were alone among millions. Here, she was alone in the truest sense, surrounded by wilderness and darkness and the weight of unanswered questions. As full night descended and the fire burned down to glowing embers, Sarah took the flashlight she had purchased and began a more thorough exploration of the house, moving from room to room, with the beam cutting through the shadows. She examined the bookshelves in the front room, finding technical volumes on geology and hydrology mixed with worn paperback novels, and she traced her fingers over the spines, imagining her grandmother's hands doing the same. In the kitchen, she opened drawers and cupboards, finding the ordinary implements of daily life, and it was while examining the far wall near the pantry that she noticed something she had missed earlier in the daylight. There was a door, smaller than the others, painted the same faded white as the walls and easy to overlook, set low and flush with the floor in a way that suggested it led down to a root cellar or storage space. She pulled on the handle, but it did not budge, and when she directed her flashlight at the lock mechanism, she felt a cold shock of wrongness run through her. The lock was not an old brass antique or a simple latch that would match the age and character of the house, but a modern industrial deadbolt, heavy-duty and new, the kind of lock you would use to secure something valuable or dangerous, completely out of place in this old farmhouse. She tried to force it, bracing her foot against the wall and pulling with all her strength, but the door was solid and the lock did not give even a fraction of an inch. She retrieved a screwdriver from the supplies she had bought and attempted to remove the lock's faceplate, but the screws had been sealed with some kind of permanent adhesive, and after 20 minutes of frustrating effort, she gave up, adding this mystery to the growing list of things that did not make sense about this property. She climbed the stairs to the small bedroom she had prepared, exhausted from the long day and the emotional weight of everything she had discovered, and she lay down on the bed fully clothed, the flashlight beside her, telling herself she would sleep lightly, stay alert. It was sometime after midnight when she woke to a sound that did not belong to the natural settling of an old house, the distinct creak of a footstep on the wooden porch. She lay perfectly still, her heart hammering, her hand reaching for the flashlight but not turning it on, and she heard it again, a careful, deliberate step, then another, and then the soft metallic sound of someone testing the front door handle, trying to turn it slowly, quietly, checking to see if it was locked. A low voice, male, spoke in a near whisper that carried through the thin walls, and she caught fragments of words. Lights were on earlier and just checking, and then the unmistakable squelch of a radio acknowledging the transmission. Sarah slipped out of bed and moved to the window, staying back from the glass, and peered out into the darkness of the valley, and what she saw made her blood run cold. There were lights, at least 4 of them, the narrow beams of powerful flashlights moving through the tree line that surrounded the property, sweeping back and forth in a coordinated pattern, a perimeter search, and she understood with absolute certainty that she was being watched, that whoever had been maintaining this property's isolation for 20 years knew she had arrived, and they were not going to let her stay without a fight. Sarah woke with the first light of dawn, having slept fitfully through the remainder of the night with every sound sending her heart racing, and she rose with a grim determination that had been forged in harder places than this isolated valley. The watchers in the darkness had not approached the house again after that first test of the door. But she knew they were out there, and the knowledge sat like a stone in her stomach as she ate a cold breakfast and planned her next move. If someone was trying to intimidate her into leaving, they had badly misjudged who they were dealing with, and if her grandmother had left her a message saying the truth was in the land, then Sarah intended to find out what that truth was, starting with a thorough exploration of the property in daylight. She crossed the overgrown yard to the barn, a massive structure that leaned slightly to one side where its foundation had settled, its sliding door hanging from a single rusted rail. She forced it open far enough to slip inside, and the interior was a cavern of shadows and dust-filled light that streamed through gaps in the walls. The ground floor was mostly empty, except for old farming equipment, rusted hand tools, and the remnants of hay bales that had decomposed into fragrant mulch. But a wooden ladder led up to a loft, and Sarah climbed it carefully, testing each rung before trusting it with her full weight. The loft was a long, open space under the peaked roof, and it was clearly where Elizabeth had stored things she wanted to keep dry and secure. Sarah found stacks of old furniture, boxes of canning jars, and in the far corner, partially hidden under a canvas tarp, a large steamer trunk with a heavy padlock securing its hasp. The lock was old and rusted, and when Sarah searched the barn, she found a rusty crowbar among the scattered tools, and used it to pry the lock free with a screech of protesting metal. She lifted the heavy lid, and what she found inside made her sit back on her heels in stunned surprise. The trunk was filled with professional equipment, and not the tools of farming but the instruments of scientific inquiry. There was a surveyor's transit in a protective case, its brass fittings tarnished but still intact. There were coiled measuring tapes, a compass, a handheld GPS unit that was decades old, sample collection vials in careful rows, and most importantly, a stack of large topographical maps and a series of field notebooks bound in weathered leather. Sarah pulled out the maps and spread them across the dusty loft floor, weighing down the corners with pieces of old wood, and she felt her breath catch as she examined them. The maps showed the farm property and the surrounding area in meticulous detail, with contour lines indicating elevation and blue lines marking streams and water sources, and covering every inch of the paper were dozens of handwritten notations in a neat, precise script that Sarah now recognized as her grandmother's hand. Each notation was marked with a small red dot and consisted of a date, a sample number, and a brief description, and as Sarah read through them, a pattern of horror began to emerge. Water sample 3, taken the 12th of June 2003, arsenic levels critical, exceeds safe drinking standards by factor of 40. Soil sample 12, taken the 5th of August 2003, heavy metal contamination, cadmium and lead present in toxic concentrations. Creek sediment sample 7, taken the 20th of September 2003, evidence of industrial runoff, unidentified chemical compounds. The notations went on and on, covering not just the farm property but extending into the surrounding national forest land, following the watershed, tracking the spread of contamination through the valley's water system. Sarah pulled out the field notebooks and found page after page of detailed observations, measurements, photographs taped to the pages, and chemical analysis results, all documenting a systematic environmental disaster that had been ongoing for years, perhaps decades. In the back of the last notebook, tucked into a small pocket, she found a business card, its edges worn soft from handling, and the text printed on it revealed a truth that recontextualized everything she had learned about her grandmother. The card read, Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, environmental geologist, United States Geological Survey, retired 1995, and below that, a phone number that was surely no longer in service. Her grandmother had not been a simple farmer living a quiet life in the mountains, and she had been a scientist, a trained geologist with the knowledge and skills to recognize and document environmental contamination, and she had spent the final years of her life conducting what appeared to be a comprehensive study of a poisoning that was spreading through the land, through the water, and into the communities downstream. And as Sarah sat in that dusty barn loft, surrounded by the evidence of her grandmother's life's work, she understood that Elizabeth Hayes had not simply disappeared, and she had been silenced because she had discovered something that powerful people desperately wanted to keep hidden. Sarah returned from the barn with the same crowbar she had used to open the trunk, along with a hammer, a screwdriver, and a grim determination that had carried her through far worse obstacles than a locked door. She positioned herself in front of the mysterious cellar entrance, studying the modern industrial lock that was so jarringly out of place in the old farmhouse. And she understood that whatever lay behind this door was important enough that someone had gone to considerable expense to seal it off, to keep it hidden and secure. She wedged the flat end of the crowbar between the door and the frame, searching for leverage, and began to apply steady, increasing pressure. The wood around the lock was old and somewhat brittle, and she worked methodically, not trying to force the lock itself but attacking the frame, the weakest point in the system. For 2 hours she labored, sweat beading on her forehead despite the coolness of the house, her hands blistering and her shoulders burning with the effort, and she paused periodically to examine her progress, to adjust her angle of attack, to chip away at the wood with the screwdriver. The lock held stubbornly, but the frame began to splinter, hairline cracks appearing around the screws that held the strike plate, and Sarah felt a savage satisfaction as she redoubled her efforts. Finally, with a sharp crack that echoed through the kitchen, the wood gave way, the entire lock assembly tearing free from the compromised frame, and the door swung inward to reveal not the cramped root cellar she had expected but a descending stone staircase that disappeared into absolute darkness. The air that flowed up from below was cool and dry, carrying a faint mineral smell and the scent of paper and chemicals, and Sarah stood at the threshold for a long moment, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She retrieved the kerosene lantern she had found in the barn, lit it with hands that trembled slightly, and began her descent. The staircase was steep and narrow, carved directly into the bedrock, the walls rough stone that glistened with moisture, and she counted 15 steps before reaching the bottom and stepping into a space that took her breath away. The cellar was not a small storage space, but a vast underground room, at least 30 feet square, with a ceiling supported by thick wooden beams and stone pillars. Someone, and Sarah knew it had been Elizabeth, had converted this natural cavity into a fully functional laboratory and archive, a hidden command center for research that had been conducted in absolute secrecy. Metal shelving units lined 3 of the 4 walls, industrial gray shelves that rose from floor to ceiling, and they were filled with hundreds, perhaps thousands, of carefully labeled samples. Sarah walked along the shelves with the lantern held high, reading the labels in her grandmother's precise handwriting. Glass vials contained water samples from dozens of locations, each labeled with GPS coordinates, dates, and preliminary observations. Plastic containers held soil samples, their contents ranging from dark, rich earth to strange gray sludge. Core samples extracted from rock formations were stored in long tubes, their contents visible through clear plastic, showing layers of sediment and stone. Each sample was catalogued, numbered, part of a comprehensive system that spoke of years of dedicated work. Against the far wall stood a row of filing cabinets, the old metal kind with multiple drawers, and when Sarah opened them, she found organized folders containing typed reports, handwritten notes, photographs, and what appeared to be correspondence with various government agencies. In the center of the room stood a large work table, and on it was something that made Sarah stop and stare in wonder. A detailed 3-dimensional topographical model of the entire valley, constructed with such precision and care that it looked like a work of art. The model showed every ridge and valley, every stream and landmark, built to scale with what appeared to be papier-mâché and paint, and scattered across its surface were dozens of red pins, each one marking a location that corresponded to the samples on the shelves, creating a visual map of the contamination spread. On the wall behind the table hung a large chalkboard, its surface covered with chemical formulas written in white chalk, calculations of concentration levels and dispersion rates, diagrams showing how contaminants moved through groundwater, and projections of how far the poisoning had spread and would continue to spread. Sarah stood in the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in, the lantern light casting flickering shadows across the fruits of her grandmother's obsessive, solitary labor, and she understood that she was standing in a tomb of knowledge, a repository of evidence that proved beyond any doubt that something terrible had been happening in this valley for decades, that people had been poisoned, that the land and water had been contaminated, and that Elizabeth Hayes had dedicated the final years of her life to documenting the crime with scientific precision, knowing that someday someone would find this place and finish the work she had started. Sarah spent hours in the underground laboratory going through the filing cabinets, pulling out folder after folder, and it was in the 3rd cabinet, in a drawer labeled medical data, that she found something that made her blood run cold and her hands shake with a fury she had not felt since her earliest days in the reformatory. The folders contained photocopies of public records, death certificates, and medical reports that Elizabeth had painstakingly collected from county health departments, hospitals, and newspaper obituaries. And each document had been carefully annotated with the deceased's age, location, cause of death, and date. Sarah spread the papers across the work table, pushing aside some of the sample vials to make room, and as she read through them, a pattern emerged that was so clear, so undeniable, that she felt physically sick. Over the past 30 years, the small communities downstream from this valley, towns like Timber Falls, and the even smaller settlements along the creek and river system that drained from these mountains, had experienced cancer rates that were 4 times the national average. The victims ranged in age from children to elderly, but the clustering of certain rare cancers was statistically impossible to explain as coincidence. There were cases of childhood leukemia, a disease that should be extraordinarily rare, appearing in numbers that suggested an environmental cause. Brain tumors, liver cancers, kidney failures, diseases of the blood and organs that filtered toxins, all appearing with a frequency that screamed of systematic poisoning. Elizabeth had mapped every case on a large chart that Sarah found rolled up in the bottom of the drawer, and when she spread it out, she saw dots representing deaths clustered along the waterways, following the flow of contamination from the mountains down through the valley and into the communities where people drank the water, irrigated their gardens, and bathed their children. The pattern was undeniable, a trail of death that led back to somewhere in this valley, to a source that had been poisoning the land and water for decades, and these people, these families who had lost children and parents and siblings, had never known why, had never been told that their suffering was not random misfortune, but the result of someone's crime. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she read the names, saw the ages, saw a 5-year-old girl dead from leukemia in 1998, a 42-year-old father of 3, dead from brain cancer in 2002, a teenage boy in 2004, an elderly woman in 1995, on and on. A litany of loss that represented real people, real lives cut short by contamination they could not see or taste or smell. She set the death certificates aside and picked up a leather-bound journal that lay on the table next to the topographical model, its cover worn smooth by handling. And she opened it to find her grandmother's personal log, entries dated from 2003 through early 2005, documenting her investigation, her growing horror at what she was finding, and her determination to expose the truth. Sarah flipped to the final pages, the last entries Elizabeth had ever written, and she read them with a growing sense of dread. The entries from early 2005 described Elizabeth's discovery of the actual contamination source, a location she had been searching for after years of tracking the spread pattern backward to its origin, and she wrote with barely contained anger about finding evidence of decades of illegal dumping, of corporate malfeasance, of a crime so massive and so callous that it beggared belief. The final entry, dated the 15th of March 2005, was written in a hand that seemed shakier than the earlier entries, as if Elizabeth had been writing quickly or under stress, and the words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The entry read, "I have found the source, the actual dumping site, and the evidence is irrefutable, and they have been doing this for decades, poisoning the water that hundreds of families depend on, killing children, and they knew, they had to know what they were doing. And I am taking the complete sample set and all documentation to the EPA field office in Missoula tomorrow morning, and I have contacted an investigative journalist who has agreed to publish the story, and if anything happens to me, if I do not make it back from this trip, the evidence must survive. It must be found. It must be used to bring these people to justice, and I have prepared everything for Sarah, my granddaughter who I have never met but who I have been watching from afar through the foster system, the only family I have left, the only connection to my daughter who I lost to her own demons. And I know from the reports I received that Sarah is strong, that she is a fighter, that she has survived terrible things, and she will be the only one brave enough to finish this work when the time comes. And I pray that she forgives me for this burden, for this inheritance of truth and responsibility. But there is no one else, and the dead deserve justice, and the living deserve to know why their loved ones were taken from them." Sarah closed the journal and sat in the silent underground laboratory, surrounded by the evidence of her grandmother's murder. Because that is what it was, Elizabeth had not disappeared. She had been killed to silence her, killed before she could reach the EPA, killed by people who valued profit over human life. And as Sarah looked at the death certificates scattered across the table, at the names of the children who had died, she felt something harden inside her, a core of absolute determination that was forged from grief and rage, and the understanding that she had been chosen for this, prepared for this, and she would not fail. Sarah emerged from the cellar late in the afternoon, her mind reeling from everything she had discovered, and she had just replaced the broken door and was standing in the kitchen trying to decide her next move when she heard the sound of an approaching vehicle, the low rumble of a powerful engine that was completely different from the rattling taxi that had brought her partway up the mountain 2 days earlier. She moved to the front window and watched as a sleek black SUV, new and expensive with tinted windows and chrome trim that gleamed in the afternoon sun, came up the overgrown track and pulled to a stop in front of the farmhouse. The vehicle sat idling for a long moment, and Sarah felt her body tense, every instinct honed by years of survival, telling her that whoever was inside represented a threat. And then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was in his 50s, tall and well-built in the way of someone who had personal trainers and country club memberships, and he wore an expensive charcoal suit that was completely impractical for the mountain setting, the kind of suit that was designed to project power and wealth. His hair was silver at the temples, perfectly styled, and his face was handsome in a practiced way, with strong features and a smile that appeared automatically as he approached the house, the kind of smile politicians and salesmen wore, broad and friendly and completely empty of genuine warmth. Sarah opened the door before he could knock, stepping out onto the porch and meeting him on her territory, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, a quick assessment and recalculation, as if he had expected someone easier to intimidate. He extended his hand in greeting, his smile never wavering, and introduced himself in a smooth baritone voice that had been trained to inspire confidence and trust. "I am Richard Vance, Vice President of Community Relations for Apex Resource Group, and you must be Sarah Hayes, and I want to welcome you to the community and offer my condolences on the loss of your grandmother, though I understand you never had the opportunity to meet her." Sarah did not take his offered hand, letting it hang in the air between them until he lowered it with a slight tightening of his smile, and she said nothing, waiting for him to reveal his true purpose. And Vance seemed unperturbed by her silence, continuing with the ease of a man who was accustomed to getting his way. "I will be direct with you, Miss Hayes, because I respect your time and mine, and Apex Resource Group is prepared to make you a very generous offer for this property, $200,000, cash, which I think you will agree is far more than this land is worth in its current condition, and the transaction could be completed within the week, giving you the financial freedom to start fresh wherever you choose." The offer was obscene, 40 times what Sarah had learned the property was valued at for tax purposes, and the size of it confirmed what she had already suspected, that there was something on this land that Apex desperately wanted, something worth far more than $200,000. She looked at Vance with steady gray eyes that had stared down guards and gang leaders in the reformatory, and she said in a flat, hard voice that allowed no room for negotiation that the property was not for sale. Not now, not ever, and she would appreciate it if he would leave. The smile finally slipped from Vance's face, replaced by something colder, more calculating, and when he spoke again, the friendly tone was gone, replaced by something that was almost conversational, but carried an unmistakable edge of menace. "That is disappointing, Miss Hayes, because I have done my research on you, and I know about your criminal record, about the 9 years you spent in the reformatory, about how difficult it must be for someone with your background to find legitimate opportunities, and it seems to me that someone in your position would jump at the chance for financial security, rather than trying to eke out an existence in this isolated valley with no prospects and no future. And I would also hate to see the authorities take an interest in whether a convicted felon on parole is violating the terms of her release by living in such a remote location without proper supervision or employment." It was a threat wrapped in the veneer of concern, a clear message that he could make her life very difficult if she did not comply, and Sarah felt the old familiar anger rise in her chest, the same rage that had sustained her through the worst years of her life, and she stepped forward into Vance's personal space, close enough that he had to look directly into her eyes, and she spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried the absolute certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I spent 9 years learning to survive in a place where people like you do not last a day, and I am not afraid of threats, and I am not afraid of you. And this land is mine, and you need to get off it right now and never come back." For a moment, Vance's mask of civility cracked completely, and Sarah saw naked fury in his eyes, saw his hands clench into fists at his sides, but then he mastered himself, stepping back and smoothing his suit jacket with deliberate care. "You are making a serious mistake, miss Hayes," he said, his voice now completely devoid of pretense, "and you will regret this decision." And then he turned and walked back to his SUV, climbing in and driving away in a spray of gravel and dust. And Sarah stood on the porch watching him go, knowing that she had just made a powerful enemy and that the real fight was only beginning. Sarah had been expecting them, and when the sound of shattering glass jolted her from a light, restless sleep 2 nights after Richard Vance's visit, she was already rolling out of bed and grabbing the heavy steel wrench she had placed on the floor beside her, her body moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to fight for survival in the reformatory's worst moments. She had been sleeping fully clothed in jeans and a flannel shirt, her boots loosely laced and ready, because she knew that Vance would not simply accept her refusal, that men like him did not give up when someone said no, and she had spent the past 2 days preparing for exactly this scenario. The crash had come from the kitchen, and she heard the sounds of multiple people moving through the house, the heavy tread of boots on the wooden floor, the low, urgent whispers of men coordinating their actions, and she counted at least 3 distinct voices. They were searching for something, moving through rooms with purpose, and Sarah knew exactly what they wanted, and they were after Elizabeth's evidence, the samples and documents that proved Apex's crimes. But what they did not know was that Sarah had already moved everything of critical importance, had spent yesterday afternoon carefully photographing every document, every sample label, every page of her grandmother's journals, uploading the digital files to a cloud storage account she had created using the farmhouse's ancient but functional satellite internet connection that Elizabeth had installed years ago. The physical evidence was no longer in the cellar but hidden in a location they would never think to search, and she would be damned if she let them destroy what remained. She moved silently to the bedroom door and positioned herself in the darkest corner, the wrench held low and ready, and she waited with the patience of a predator as the footsteps climbed the stairs. The first man through the door was large, over 6 feet tall and heavily built, and he moved with his flashlight held in one hand and what looked like a pry bar in the other. And he never saw Sarah until she stepped forward and swung the wrench with all her strength into his knee. The sound of the impact was a sickening crack, and the man went down with a howl of pain, his flashlight clattering across the floor, and Sarah did not hesitate, bringing the wrench down again on his outstretched hand, feeling bones break under the blow. The second man rushed through the door, drawn by his companion's screams, and Sarah met him with the feral desperation of a street fighter, someone who had learned in dark alleys and prison yards that you fought dirty and you fought to win. She went for his eyes with her free hand, her fingers clawing, and when he jerked back in reflexive protection, she brought the wrench up in a vicious uppercut that caught him under the chin and sent him stumbling backward into the hallway. The third man, smarter or more cautious than his companions, did not enter the room but instead retreated down the stairs, and she heard him speaking urgently into a radio, his voice carrying clearly in the chaos. "The cellar is empty. She must have moved it. And we have 2 men down. Abort, abort." The injured men scrambled to their feet and fled, the first man dragging his shattered leg, leaving smears of blood on the floor, and Sarah chased them to the top of the stairs, watching as they stumbled out the broken kitchen door and into the night, their vehicle roaring to life and disappearing down the trail. She stood in the darkness, her heart pounding, the wrench still gripped in her white-knuckled hand, and she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to shake with the aftershocks of adrenaline before forcing herself into action. She could not stay here, not now that they knew she had moved the evidence, because they would come back with more men, with better preparation, and she needed to protect what Elizabeth had died for. She spent the rest of the night working by lamplight in the barn, using tools and skills she had learned in the Reformatory's carpentry workshop, constructing a false bottom in the old grain silo, a space large enough to hold the filing cabinets and sample cases. She moved everything from the cellar, making multiple trips through the darkness, her muscles screaming in protest, and by the time the sun rose over the eastern peaks, the evidence was hidden in a place that would require demolishing the entire silo to discover. And Sarah stood in the barn's doorway, exhausted and battered but grimly satisfied, knowing that she had won this round but that the war was far from over. Sarah drove into Timber Falls the next morning in the battered pickup truck she had found in Elizabeth's barn with the keys still in the ignition, the engine turning over after some coaxing and fresh gas. And she went directly to the sheriff's office, a small brick building on Main Street with a faded American flag hanging limply from a pole out front. The interior was sparse and institutional, with scuffed linoleum floors and walls painted a depressing shade of beige, and behind a desk cluttered with paperwork sat Sheriff Clayton Briggs, a man in his late 50s with a thick neck, thinning hair, and the kind of face that suggested he had stopped caring about much of anything a long time ago. He looked up as Sarah entered, his expression settling into a practiced neutrality that was neither welcoming nor hostile, and he listened with apparent patience as she reported the break-in, describing the three men. The violence, the radio communication, the fact that they had been searching for something specific. Briggs took notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen moving slowly across the paper, and when Sarah finished, he leaned back in his chair and regarded her with eyes that held something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. "Miss Hayes," he said in a tone that suggested he was choosing his words carefully, "you have been out at that property for what, 4 days now, all alone in a house that has been empty for 20 years. And I imagine that can play tricks on the mind, especially at night when every sound gets magnified. And it is entirely possible that you heard some local teenagers poking around, kids looking for a place to drink beer and raise hell, and maybe you startled them and they ran off. But 3 armed men breaking in to search for evidence, that sounds like something out of a movie. Do you not think?" Sarah felt her jaw tighten, recognizing the dismissal for what it was, and she insisted that she knew the difference between teenagers and professional intruders, that one of the men had spoken into a radio using specific language that suggested coordination and purpose, and that she had injured at least one of them badly enough to require medical attention, and perhaps the sheriff could check with local hospitals or clinics. Briggs sighed and made a show of adding to his notes, saying he would file a report and keep an eye out, but his tone made it clear that nothing would be investigated, that this was a performance designed to satisfy legal requirements without any intention of actual action. And as Sarah stood to leave, frustrated and angry, her eyes fell on a plaque mounted on the wall behind the sheriff's desk, a brass plate engraved with the words, "Apex Resource Group, proud supporter of local law enforcement," and she understood with perfect clarity that there would be no help coming from official channels. She left the sheriff's office and walked to Frank's Mercantile, needing supplies and hoping that the old shopkeeper might offer some insight or assistance. And when she entered, Frank was behind the counter as before, but this time his expression was not cold but worried, anxious, and he served her in silence while 2 other customers browsed the aisles. As Frank handed Sarah her change, his weathered hand closed briefly over hers, and she felt the crinkle of paper being pressed into her palm, and he met her eyes for just a moment with a look of urgent warning before turning away to help another customer. Sarah pocketed the note without looking at it and left the store, and only when she was alone in the truck did she unfold the small piece of paper and read the message written in shaky handwriting. "Get out while you can. Your grandmother tried to fight them. Look what happened to her. They own everything here. You cannot win." The note confirmed what she already suspected, but it also told her that there were people in this town who knew the truth, who remembered Elizabeth, and who were too frightened to speak openly. And Sarah tucked the note into her jacket and drove to the town's small public library, a single-room building that smelled of old books and was overseen by an elderly librarian who seemed grateful for any visitor. Sarah asked to see archived newspapers from 2005, and the librarian directed her to a back room where old editions had been preserved on microfilm, and Sarah spent the next 2 hours scrolling through grainy images until she found what she was looking for. The articles about Elizabeth's disappearance were brief, relegated to the back pages, and the official story was exactly as Margaret Sterling had described. Elizabeth Hayes, local resident, had failed to return from a hiking trip in the mountains and was presumed lost. Search efforts had been minimal and quickly abandoned, and 6 months later she had been declared legally dead with no body ever recovered, no investigation conducted, and no questions asked. Just a quiet closing of a case that no one in power wanted to examine too closely. And as Sarah sat in the dim back room of the library staring at the final article, a 2-paragraph obituary that made no mention of Elizabeth's career as a scientist or her years of environmental research, she felt the full weight of the conspiracy settle over her. Understanding that she was fighting not just a corporation but an entire system that had been corrupted and bought, and that her grandmother had died alone, silenced, and forgotten because she had dared to challenge that power. Sarah returned to the farm with a new sense of purpose, and she spent that evening in the hidden cellar studying Elizabeth's topographical maps, tracing the red marks that indicated contamination samples backward to their source, following the watershed up into the mountains, and she found what she was looking for. A location marked with a black X and a notation that read Source, confirmed the 10th of March 2005, Canyon Creek Mine, active illegal operation. The next morning, she packed a small backpack with water, energy bars, a camera, and copies of the relevant maps, and she set out on foot, following game trails and old logging roads deep into the national forest that bordered her property to the north. The hike took 3 hours, climbing steadily through dense pine forest and across rocky outcrops, and she used Elizabeth's maps like a treasure hunter following clues, recognizing landmarks her grandmother had sketched: a distinctive lightning-struck tree, a boulder shaped like a crouching bear, a creek crossing where the water ran rust-orange over white stones. The terrain grew rougher as she climbed, the forest thicker, and she had to push through dense underbrush that tore at her clothes. But she pressed on with the same stubborn determination that had carried her through the reformatory, and finally, she heard it, the distant mechanical rumble of heavy equipment, a sound that did not belong in this wilderness. She approached the final ridge cautiously, staying low, using the trees for cover, and when she reached the top and looked down into the canyon below, she felt her breath catch in her throat. Spread out before her was a mining operation, a scar carved into the mountainside, and it was not the abandoned relic it was supposed to be according to official records, but an active, functioning facility. She could see heavy equipment, a massive excavator and several dump trucks, moving earth and rock, and there were temporary structures, metal buildings that looked like offices or equipment storage, and most damning of all, a series of large concrete settling ponds filled with sludge that was a sickly gray-green color, clearly toxic runoff from the mining process. She pulled out the camera and began photographing everything, zooming in on the Apex Resource Group logos painted on the equipment, on the license plates of the trucks, on the pipes that ran from the settling ponds down the hillside and disappeared into a fissure in the rock. A natural crack that she knew from Elizabeth's geological surveys led directly to the underground aquifer that fed every stream and well in the valley below. This was it, the source of the contamination, decades of illegal dumping directly into the water supply, and they had hidden it here in a remote canyon on public land, using an abandoned mine as cover, operating with complete impunity because they owned the local authorities and could ensure no one ever looked too closely. She was so focused on documenting the scene that she did not hear the approaching footsteps until a voice behind her barked, "Hey, you, this is private property, do not move." Sarah spun around to see 2 men in Apex security uniforms, both carrying radios and wearing utility belts that held pepper spray and batons, and they were positioned between her and her escape route back down the trail. For a heartbeat, she froze, and then her survival instincts kicked in and she ran, not back the way she had come but sideways along the ridge, crashing through the underbrush with the 2 guards shouting and giving chase. She ran with desperate speed, her lungs burning in the thin mountain air, branches whipping her face and roots trying to trip her feet, and she could hear them behind her, closer than she wanted, their heavy boots pounding the earth. She veered down a steep slope, half running and half sliding, grabbing at saplings to control her descent, and she splashed across a creek and scrambled up the far bank, her hands bleeding from the rocks and her legs screaming in protest. She used Elizabeth's maps in her mind, visualizing the terrain, knowing there was a narrow ravine ahead that would be difficult for the larger men to navigate, and she pushed toward it, squeezing through a gap between 2 boulders that the guards could not follow, and she heard their frustrated curses as they were forced to go around. She ran for another 20 minutes, putting distance between herself and her pursuers, using every trick of evasion she had ever learned, and finally, when she could no longer hear them behind her, she collapsed behind a fallen log, gasping for breath and shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. She checked the camera, and it was still intact, the images safe, the evidence secured, and as she began the long, careful journey back to the farm, moving through the forest like a fugitive, she understood that she was no longer just investigating her grandmother's murder, but had become a direct and immediate threat to Apex's illegal operation, and they would come for her now with everything they had. Sarah made it halfway back to the farm before her body gave out, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the desperate flight, finally draining away and leaving her weak and shaking. And she stumbled down an embankment to a small creek, collapsing onto the mossy bank with her muscles trembling and her vision blurring at the edges. She lay there for what might have been minutes or hours, too exhausted to move, her hand still bleeding from the rocks and her ankle throbbing where she had twisted it during her descent down the ravine. And she was drifting into a dangerous half-conscious state when she heard footsteps approaching and a woman's voice asking with genuine concern if she was hurt. Sarah forced her eyes open to see a woman in her 30s kneeling beside her, wearing a Forest Service uniform with a radio clipped to her belt and concern etched across her kind face. And she introduced herself as Rebecca Cole, a wildlife biologist conducting field surveys in this area, and she helped Sarah sit up and offered her water from a canteen. As Sarah drank, Rebecca examined her injuries with the efficient care of someone trained in wilderness first aid, cleaning the cuts on her hands and wrapping her ankle with an elastic bandage from her field pack. And she asked what Sarah was doing so far into the backcountry, and Sarah, seeing something in Rebecca's eyes that suggested she might be an ally rather than another obstacle, made a decision to trust her. She pulled out the camera and showed Rebecca the photographs of the illegal mining operation, explained about her grandmother's research and the evidence of contamination, and as she spoke, she saw Rebecca's expression shift from professional interest to shock and then to something that looked like grief and vindication mixed together. Rebecca sat back on her heels, tears streaming down her face, and she told Sarah that she had been documenting environmental damage in this forest for 5 years, finding dead zones in the streams where nothing lived, seeing wildlife populations crash, observing the slow poisoning of the ecosystem. But every report she filed had been buried by her superiors. Every attempt to investigate had been shut down, and she had known something terrible was happening but had been powerless to prove it or stop it. She reached out and took Sarah's hand, her voice breaking as she said that her own mother had died of liver cancer 10 years ago, a terrible wasting death that had taken her far too young. And Sarah pulled out her phone where she had photographed Elizabeth's death certificate files and scrolled through until she found the entry. Margaret Cole, age 52, liver cancer, died February 2015, Timber Falls. And Rebecca sobbed when she saw her mother's name on the list, understanding finally that her mother's death had not been random misfortune but murder, a casualty of corporate greed and criminal negligence. Rebecca composed herself and told Sarah that she had a friend at the EPA, a field agent named Marcus Webb, who worked out of the regional office and was not part of the local power structure, someone who could be trusted. But they would need more than photographs and historical data. They would need to catch Apex in the act, document them actively dumping, create evidence so undeniable that even the corrupted system could not ignore it. She had heard rumors through her network of seasonal workers that there was a major scheduled waste dump happening in 3 days at the mine site, a regular operation they conducted under cover of darkness. And if Sarah and Rebecca could get there, document it, record the actual dumping in progress, they would have everything they needed to bring the entire criminal enterprise down. They met the next morning at Rebecca's small cabin on the outskirts of Timber Falls, a modest one-room structure surrounded by pine trees that served as her base during field seasons. And Rebecca had already begun assembling the equipment they would need for their operation. She laid out a professional-grade video camera with night vision capabilities, explaining that it was Forest Service property she was requisitioning under the pretense of documenting nocturnal wildlife, along with extra batteries, memory cards, and a telephoto lens that would allow them to film from a safe distance. Sarah watched as Rebecca spread topographical maps across her small kitchen table, maps far more detailed than even Elizabeth's, showing the mine site from multiple angles, the access roads, the placement of security, and the natural cover they could use for concealment. They spent the next 2 days in careful preparation, driving separately to observation points in the forest during different times of day, watching the mine's patterns of activity, documenting when shifts changed, when security patrols made their rounds, when the heavy equipment operated and when it fell silent. Rebecca had the trained eye of a scientist, noting details and recording observations in a field notebook, while Sarah brought the street-smart awareness of someone who had learned to read threats and identify weaknesses, and together they formed a team that was stronger than either could have been alone. During the long hours of surveillance, sitting hidden in the forest with binoculars and patience, they talked, and Sarah learned that Rebecca was risking everything she had built to help with this operation. Rebecca had worked for the Forest Service for 8 years, had earned her position through a PhD in wildlife biology and countless hours of fieldwork, And if her superiors discovered she was actively investigating Apex without authorization, she would lose her job, her career, possibly face criminal charges for misuse of government equipment and insubordination. When Sarah asked why she was willing to take such risks, Rebecca was quiet for a long moment before answering, her voice soft but steady, saying that she knew what it was like to be judged, to be dismissed, to fight for acceptance in a world that did not want to make space for you. She explained that she had come out as a lesbian in her mid-20s, here in this conservative mountain town where such things were not discussed and certainly not accepted, and she had endured years of subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination, of whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, of professional opportunities that mysteriously evaporated, of being perpetually underestimated and overlooked because people saw her identity before they saw her capabilities. She had learned to be tough, to fight for every scrap of respect, to prove herself over and over again, and she had also learned that sometimes the most important fights were the ones where you stood up, not just for yourself but for people who could no longer stand up for themselves, and her mother was one of those people, and so were all the other names on Elizabeth's list. Sarah found herself sharing in return, speaking about things she rarely discussed, the crime she had committed at 19, stealing from a convenience store because she was starving and desperate and had aged out of the foster system with nowhere to go, and how a moment of desperation had cost her 9 years of her life in the reformatory. She talked about the violence she had witnessed and participated in, the brutal hierarchy of prison life, the way the system ground you down and tried to convince you that you were worthless, that you deserved nothing better, and how she had survived by becoming hard, by learning to fight, by refusing to break no matter what was done to her. She told Rebecca about the carpentry workshop and old Bill who had taught her that her hands could create as well as destroy, and about the women who had become her family in that terrible place, and about walking out with $43 and no prospects, and believing that she would never be anything more than her worst mistake. They sat together in the forest, two women who had been underestimated and judged and dismissed their entire lives, and they understood each other in a way that went beyond words. And as the sun set on the second day of surveillance and they finalized their plan for the operation that would take place tomorrow night, Sarah felt something she had not felt since before the reformatory, the sense that she was not alone, that she had found someone who would stand beside her not because they had to but because they chose to, and together they were fighting for something bigger than themselves, fighting for justice, for truth, for the memory of Elizabeth Hayes and Margaret Cole and all the others who had died in silence. The night was moonless and cold when Sarah and Rebecca began their hike to the overlook, moving through the dark forest with only hooded flashlights to guide their steps. And they reached their position an hour before midnight, settling into a natural depression in the rock that gave them a clear view of the mine site below, while keeping them hidden in shadow. Rebecca set up the camera on its tripod, adjusting the night vision settings until the green-tinted image showed the entire canyon in eerie detail. And they waited in tense silence until they heard the distant rumble of approaching vehicles. 3 heavy trucks appeared on the camouflaged access road, and Sarah felt her heart begin to race as she watched them pull into the mine site and park near the settling ponds. Men emerged from the trucks, at least 6 of them, and they began unloading barrels, 55-gallon drums marked with bright orange hazardous waste symbols that were clearly visible even at this distance. And the operation was conducted with the efficiency of routine, of something that had been done many times before. Sarah began filming, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, capturing everything: the Apex logos on the trucks, the faces of the workers, the hazardous waste markings, and most damning of all, the moment when they rolled the barrels to the edge of the large fissure in the rock and simply pushed them over, letting them tumble into the crack that Elizabeth's geological surveys had identified as a direct conduit to the underground aquifer. The barrels disappeared into the earth, carrying their poison into the water that fed the entire valley. And Sarah kept filming, documenting the crime in progress, and she was so focused on the camera that she did not see the security patrol approaching from behind until Rebecca grabbed her arm in warning, but it was already too late. Floodlights exploded across the hillside, massive portable lights that turned night into day and illuminated their position as clearly as if they were on a stage. And Sarah heard shouted commands and saw armed security guards rushing up the slope toward them, at least 4 men moving fast. Rebecca screamed for her to run, and they both bolted, abandoning the tripod but Sarah clutching the camera to her chest, and they split up as they had planned, Rebecca veering left toward the dense forest while Sarah went right, trying to draw the pursuers after her. She ran through the darkness with her injured ankle from days before, screaming in protest, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs, and she could hear them behind her, their shouts and the beam of their flashlights sweeping through the trees. And she used every trick she had ever learned, doubling back, running through a creek to mask her scent, choosing the hardest terrain, where her smaller size gave her an advantage. She was making progress, pulling ahead, when her foot caught on a hidden root and she pitched forward, tumbling down a steep ravine, bouncing off rocks and saplings, and she hit the bottom hard, her ankle twisting viciously beneath her, pain exploding up her legs so intense it made her vision go white. She bit down on her hand to keep from screaming and dragged herself into a small cave, barely more than an overhang of rock, and she pressed herself into the deepest shadow, the camera still clutched against her body. And she heard the guards above, their lights sweeping the ravine, their voices calling to each other, and she held her breath as they searched, praying they would not look down. And after an eternity they moved on, and Sarah was left alone in the darkness, trapped, injured, and hunted, but still holding the evidence that could bring them all down. Sarah had no idea how long she huddled in that cold cave, her injured ankle throbbing with a pain so intense it made her nauseous, listening to the sounds of the search gradually fade into the distance. And she was beginning to contemplate the grim reality of trying to crawl her way back to civilization when she heard a vehicle approaching. Not the rough engines of the Apex trucks, but the familiar rumble of a Forest Service pickup, and then Rebecca's voice calling her name in an urgent whisper that carried through the ravine. Sarah dragged herself to the edge of the cave and called back, her voice hoarse and weak, and within minutes Rebecca was scrambling down the slope, her face tight with worry and determination. And she helped Sarah up with strong arms, taking most of her weight as they climbed back to where the truck was parked on a service road. Rebecca explained in quick sentences that she had escaped her own pursuers by running toward the mine entrance rather than away, and she had used every ounce of authority she possessed to bluff her way through, flashing her Forest Service badge and explaining in an irritated official tone that she was investigating reports of illegal poaching activity and demanding to know why Apex had personnel on public land after dark without proper permits. The security guards, confused and unwilling to create an incident with a federal employee, had let her pass, and she had driven back to search for Sarah, refusing to leave without her. They loaded Sarah into the truck, and Rebecca wrapped her swelling ankle in ice from her field cooler, but when she suggested they stop at a hospital in Timber Falls, Sarah refused with a vehemence that allowed no argument, saying that going to any facility in this town would alert Apex that they had escaped, that the evidence would be confiscated, and that they had to get to the EPA office now, tonight, before anyone could stop them. Rebecca nodded and turned the truck east, away from Timber Falls, onto dark mountain highways that would take them to the regional EPA office 4 hours away in Missoula. And Sarah sat in the passenger seat, clutching the camera like a talisman, her ankles screaming in protest with every bump in the road, fighting to stay conscious through waves of pain that threatened to pull her under. They drove through the night, and Rebecca kept up a steady stream of conversation to keep Sarah alert, talking about her mother, about the hiking trips they had taken together in these mountains, about how Margaret Cole had loved the wilderness and had died never knowing that the land she cherished had been the source of her death. Dawn was breaking over the mountains when they pulled into the parking lot of the EPA regional office, a modern building of glass and steel that represented the federal power structure that existed beyond the reach of Apex's corruption, and Rebecca helped Sarah limp into the lobby, where she called Agent Marcus Webb's emergency number. Webb arrived within 20 minutes, a serious man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, and he took them to a secure conference room where Sarah, her face pale with pain and exhaustion, handed him the camera and began to explain everything. Webb watched the footage in silence, his expression growing darker with each frame, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority, saying this was a federal environmental crime of massive scope, criminal conspiracy, reckless endangerment, negligent homicide potentially, and it had been ongoing for decades. And within an hour, Sarah watched through the conference room window as federal agents began arriving, black SUVs filling the parking lot, and she knew that the fight was finally turning, that the machinery of justice was grinding into motion, and that her grandmother's truth would finally be heard. While Sarah sat in the EPA conference room, giving her statement to federal agents, her ankle wrapped in a proper medical brace and pain medication finally dulling the worst of the agony. Richard Vance was making his final desperate move 60 miles away at the farmhouse, having received word from his security team that the two women had escaped with video evidence and were likely heading to federal authorities. He understood that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly, that within hours or perhaps even minutes the full weight of federal law enforcement would descend on his operation, and his only remaining option was to destroy any physical evidence that remained at the Hayes property, to erase Elizabeth's underground laboratory and any samples or documents that might have been left behind, and to do it in a way that would appear accidental or at least provide plausible deniability. He dispatched a crew of 6 men with heavy equipment, 2 excavators loaded onto flatbed trucks, along with drums of accelerant and instructions to level the farmhouse completely, to dig up the foundation, to make it look like a methamphetamine lab explosion had destroyed the property, a story that would be easy to sell given Sarah's criminal record and the isolation of the location. What Vance did not know was that Sarah, even in her pain and exhaustion, had thought 3 steps ahead, and before leaving for the EPA office, she had asked Rebecca to call a Forest Service ranger named Tom Whitfield, one of the few people Rebecca trusted completely, and ask him to keep watch on the property from a concealed position in the tree line, to document any attempt at interference or destruction. Whitfield had agreed immediately, understanding the gravity of what was at stake. And when the Apex trucks arrived at dawn with their excavators and began unloading equipment, he radioed for backup and moved his Forest Service vehicle to block the narrow access road, preventing their escape. The standoff that followed was tense and chaotic, with Vance's crew shouting threats and demanding that Whitfield move, while the ranger calmly informed them that they were on private property without permission and that he had called for law enforcement assistance, and the crew, realizing they were trapped, attempted to continue their demolition work, firing up the excavators and moving toward the farmhouse. It was at this moment that 3 black FBI SUVs came roaring up the trail, having been expedited directly from the EPA office by Agent Webb, who had immediately understood that Vance would make a move against the evidence, and the federal agents emerged with weapons drawn, ordering everyone to the ground, and they found Vance's crew in the act of attempting to demolish the house, with accelerant already poured around the foundation and one man holding a road flare, caught red-handed in the commission of multiple federal crimes. The arrests were swift and professional, handcuffs clicking shut on wrists, rights being read, and 20 minutes later, Richard Vance himself arrived in his black SUV, having come to personally oversee what he thought would be the final destruction of the evidence, and he stepped out of his vehicle to find himself surrounded by federal agents, and the look on his face when he realized that everything had fallen apart, that his carefully constructed empire of corruption was crumbling around him, was something that Agent Webb would later describe to Sarah as the expression of a man watching his entire world end. The federal investigation that followed was swift and overwhelming, a deployment of resources that transformed the quiet valley into a scene of coordinated law enforcement action on a scale that Montana had rarely witnessed. Within 48 hours of the arrests at the farmhouse, teams of EPA investigators, FBI agents, and Department of Justice attorneys descended on the illegal mining operation. And what they found when they excavated the dump sites was even worse than Elizabeth's research had suggested. The fissure where Sarah had filmed the barrels being dumped led to a vast network of underground caverns, and when investigators rappelled down into the darkness with protective suits and sampling equipment, they discovered decades' worth of toxic waste, thousands of barrels of industrial solvents, heavy metals, and chemical compounds that had been seeping into the aquifer for more than 30 years, creating a plume of contamination that had spread through the entire watershed. The paper trail they uncovered in Apex's corporate offices was equally damning. Falsified environmental impact reports, bribes paid to county officials documented in spreadsheets, internal memos discussing the cancer clusters in language that made it clear the executives knew exactly what they were doing and had calculated that the cost of proper disposal was higher than the cost of occasional legal settlements and hush money. The EPA declared a public health emergency, ordering the immediate closure of all wells drawing from the contaminated aquifer and beginning the process of providing clean water to the affected communities. And Elizabeth's research, every sample she had collected, every death she had documented, every notation in her careful scientific hand, became the foundation of the federal criminal case. The media arrived like a flood, national news networks setting up satellite trucks in Timber Falls, and reporters wanting to interview the woman who had exposed the conspiracy. And Sarah found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never wanted, sitting for interviews where she tried to redirect attention to her grandmother's work, to the victims whose names were on those death certificates, to Rebecca who had risked everything to help. She was uncomfortable with being called a hero, with having cameras pointed at her face, with people treating her like some kind of crusader when she had simply followed the path Elizabeth had laid out for her. But she understood that the attention served a purpose, that it kept pressure on the investigation, that it ensured the victims would not be forgotten again, and so she endured the interviews and the questions, speaking about her grandmother with a pride and love she had never been able to express to the woman herself. 3 weeks into the federal investigation, a forensic accountant working through Apex's seized email servers found something that changed the entire case from environmental crime to something far darker. A chain of internal emails dated the 16th of March 2005, the day after Elizabeth's final journal entry, discussing a meeting that had taken place at Apex's regional office. The emails were carefully worded, but their meaning was unmistakable, with Richard Vance writing to 2 other executives that the situation with Dr. Hayes had been handled, that she would not be taking her samples to the EPA as threatened, and that they needed to ensure the problem did not resurface, with a follow-up email discussing the disposal of certain materials at the remote holding facility near Black Pine Ridge. FBI agents immediately obtained a warrant and descended on the location, a desolate section of Apex-owned land that had once been used for equipment storage. And they brought cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, and on the 3rd day of the search, they found her. The remains were buried 6 feet deep in an unmarked grave far from any trail or road, and the forensic team worked with painstaking care to excavate the site, treating it as both a crime scene and a sacred duty. And when DNA testing came back 2 weeks later, it confirmed what Sarah had known in her heart from the moment she read that final journal entry. The bones belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Marie Hayes, and she had not disappeared into the mountains as the official story claimed. She had been murdered, killed by men who valued their profits more than human life. The charges against Richard Vance and the 2 executives were immediately upgraded to first-degree murder with special circumstances, and Sarah sat in Agent Webb's office when he told her the news. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, she allowed herself to truly grieve, sobbing for the grandmother she had never known, for the woman who had fought alone against impossible odds, for the scientist who had documented the truth with such care knowing it might cost her everything, for the person who had thought of Sarah in her final days, who had prepared this inheritance of purpose and responsibility, who had believed that a granddaughter she had never met would be brave enough to finish the work. Agent Webb sat quietly with her, offering no empty platitudes, simply bearing witness to her grief. And when Sarah finally composed herself, she asked if she could see her grandmother's remains. And arrangements were made for a proper burial, the first member of Sarah's family she would ever be able to lay to rest with dignity and love. 6 months after Elizabeth's remains were found, the trial of Richard Vance and his co-defendants began in federal court in Helena, and Sarah sat in the public gallery every single day, dressed in simple clothes that Rebecca had helped her choose, watching as the machinery of justice ground slowly but inexorably forward. The prosecution presented their case with devastating precision, building a narrative that was impossible to refute, starting with the environmental crimes, bringing in expert witnesses who testified about the scope of the contamination, the deliberate nature of the dumping, the decades of falsified reports that showed Apex had known exactly what they were doing and had chosen profit over human life. Then came the survivors, men and women from Timber Falls and the surrounding communities who took the stand and spoke about watching their children die of leukemia, about their own battles with cancer, about the grief and confusion of losing loved ones to diseases that struck their small towns with impossible frequency. And the courtroom fell silent as a father described holding his 7-year-old daughter's hand as she died, never knowing that the water he had given her to drink had been poisoned. Rebecca testified about the years of institutional obstruction she had faced, about how her reports of environmental damage had been buried, about the moment she realized her own mother's name was on Elizabeth's list, and her testimony was delivered with the calm authority of a scientist, but the passion of a daughter seeking justice. Agent Webb walked the jury through the timeline of the cover-up, showing how Apex had systematically silenced anyone who threatened to expose their operation. And then the prosecution played the video Sarah had filmed, showing the barrels being dumped into the aquifer, and the courtroom watched in horrified silence. When Sarah was called to the stand, She walked to the witness box with her head high, and she told her story in a clear, steady voice, explaining how she had inherited a property she never knew existed, how she had found her grandmother's research, how she had nearly died to document the truth, and when the defense attorney rose for cross-examination, attempting to discredit her by bringing up her criminal record, by suggesting she was an unreliable witness with a history of dishonesty, Sarah looked him directly in the eyes and said that yes, she had made a terrible mistake when she was 19 and desperate and starving, and she had paid for that mistake with 9 years of her life. But she had learned in that hard place what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself, to stand up when it would be easier to surrender, and she would not be intimidated or shamed into silence, not by him, not by anyone. After 3 weeks of testimony that had laid bare the full scope of Apex's crimes, the jury retired to deliberate, and Sarah returned to the farmhouse to wait, unable to bear the tension of sitting in a courthouse hallway watching the clock. And she spent those 2 days walking the overgrown fields that Elizabeth had once walked, imagining the woman she had never met, trying to picture her grandmother conducting her surveys, collecting her samples, documenting the truth with scientific precision and moral courage. And Sarah found herself talking to Elizabeth as if she could hear, telling her that the work was finished, that justice was finally coming, that her death had not been in vain. When Agent Webb called on the afternoon of the second day to say the jury had reached a verdict, Sarah felt her heart constrict with anxiety and hope in equal measure, and Rebecca drove them both to the courthouse, reaching across to squeeze Sarah's hand as they parked, and they walked into a courtroom that was packed to capacity with survivors and journalists and community members who had come to witness the conclusion of this long fight for justice. The jury filed in with expressions that revealed nothing, and the judge asked the foreperson to read the verdict, and Sarah held her breath as the words came. Guilty on all counts. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of environmental crimes, guilty of racketeering, and the courtroom erupted in gasps and tears and a few scattered cheers that the judge quickly silenced. The sentencing came swiftly, with Richard Vance and the 2 executives each receiving life in prison without possibility of parole, and Apex Resource Group was fined $3 billion and ordered to fund the complete remediation of the contaminated aquifer, a cost that would force the corporation into bankruptcy and dissolution. Sarah sat motionless as the verdicts were read, feeling a profound sense of completion mixed with an aching sadness, because the victory, as total as it was, could not bring back the dead, could not restore Margaret Cole or Elizabeth Hayes or the dozens of other names on those death certificates, could not give back the years of life stolen from children who had died too young. And as she left the courthouse surrounded by reporters shouting questions, she thought about how different things might have been if someone had listened to her grandmother 20 years ago, if Elizabeth had been believed instead of silenced, if courage had been met with support instead of murder, and the weight of all those lost lives, all that preventable suffering, settled over her like a shroud even as justice was finally, belatedly, served. The EPA's cleanup of the valley would take years, but the work had begun, and a victims' compensation fund was established from Apex's liquidated assets. Sarah was entitled to a substantial settlement as Elizabeth's heir, but she did something that surprised the lawyers. She established the Elizabeth Hayes Foundation, dedicating most of the money to environmental justice causes and support for formerly incarcerated individuals trying to rebuild their lives. She kept the farm and began its restoration with Rebecca, who had resigned from the Forest Service to work beside her, and their partnership deepened into something more than friendship, into love built on shared purpose and mutual respect. 2 years after the verdict, Sarah stood before the restored farmhouse, its logs freshly chinked, the fields green with organic crops, a rebuilt barn standing proud against the mountain vista, and a small memorial garden where Elizabeth's name was carved in stone alongside all the victims. She had obtained her GED, enrolled in online environmental science courses, and learned to farm the land her grandmother had died protecting. The locals who once shunned her now called her a hero, but Sarah knew better. She was just a woman who had finished what Elizabeth started. And when a letter arrived from a young woman recently released from the reformatory asking for advice, Sarah wrote back with the truth she had learned. Second chances are real. The past does not define the future. And sometimes the most important fight is the one you never expected to have. And as she looked out at the mountains, she finally felt something she had never known before, the profound and simple truth that she belonged.